Looks like people are just late. It must be heavy traffic.
You are live.
Welcome, Brandon. All right, welcome everyone to the May 21st meeting of the Rotary Club of Beaver Creek. Happy Friday. I'm your host and president, as always, Mike Canada. I'm glad all of you could be here today. I'd like to thank our greeters. I'd like to thank Mike Zwick for our great speakers and programs, including today's speaker, Dan Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick, not Kilpatrick. I'd like to thank Jim Gundel and Alex Zaharia for our website and YouTube, and Beth Cusack for our book dedication. I'd like to welcome all of our members. I see a couple of new members that have joined us. Any guests that may be joining, I will pause here so you can introduce yourself, please.
Mike, it's Tom Kugler. It's a joy to be able to join you today and listen to Dan's presentation, which I've already heard once, and so good I want to hear it a second time.
Welcome back, Tom, as always. And a special welcome to Dan for joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dan, to speak to our club today. So far, our club's been averaging 37 on Zoom and 12 on YouTube. And with that, I will turn it over to our Sergeant at Arms, Mr. Dave Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to Tom for picking up my trash this morning. On the 21st of May, the Israelis and the Hamas have attempted a ceasefire after over 200 persons were killed by dueling rocket and air attacks. The governor of Texas is banning schools from requiring masks. I'm not sure what that's about. Congressman Clyde of Georgia calls the attack on the U.S. Capitol a tourist visit. I don't know about that either. 11-year-old girl throws blue slime on would-be kidnapper and escapes, and they arrest the kidnapper because he has on his arm some, let's hear it, blue slime. Kate Hudson snips off her boyfriend's ponytail. The BBC admits setting Princess Di up for her famous interview. And New York and Maryland have followed Ohio in creating COVID vaccine lotteries. In sports, Corey Connors takes an early lead in the PGA Championship. And a sixth baseball no-hitter has been thrown in the past 40 days. When Yankees' Corey Kluber pitched one following a similar feat the prior night by Tigers' Spencer Turnbull. And Joy Chapman, 52 years old of British Columbia, set a new Guinness World Record for the lowest note ever sung by a female. Chapman descended a scale to a deeply guttural C1. I don't know what that is. It's not even my lowest note, she boasted afterwards. The world's longest rabbit, I know this is a club that needs to be kept informed, so I always try to find the things that are the most important for you to know. The world's longest rabbit has been kidnapped. Darius, a 4-foot-long continental giant, recently went missing from his enclosure in the small English hamlet of Stolton. His owner pleaded for his safe return, posted a $2,745 reward. That's probably pounds translated into dollars or something. The 50-pound rabbit, who was certified as the world's longest by Guinness World Records, requires a special diet. It's just so upsetting because he's such a lovable character, Edwards said. And let's see, I had something else here. I can't find it. Oh well. Oh yeah. John Hinkle, 39 years old of Illinois, bowled a perfect game using a bowling ball filled with his father's ashes. I had tears in my eyes for the 11th and 12th frames, said Hinkle. And with that, let's hear some chuckles for today.
Looks like he froze, did he?
That's pretty funny.
He's waiting for us to laugh.
How many times does this happen? It's always
Whoa.
funny when it does.
Somebody take a picture.
All right, we're gonna have to cut the sergeant's report short. Well, hold on. Did he log back in? All right, we'll cut it short. We will move on to Alex is clapping. We'll move on to our show and tell portion. It usually comes right after the sergeant's report. We'll skip all the fines. All the fines are waived by me this week. Please don't send Eric any more money. Doesn't need it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Brandon Huff for our show and tell. Muted.
Boom, we there?
Yes.
I apologize. This is one of those situations in which I was leaving my office at 11 and I was going to go home and give myself 45 minutes to do this. And I walked out of my office and my coworker's window was shattered in the parking lot. And so I spent the last hour trying to help her with that. So I apologize. This was very quickly thrown together. I hope you'll bear with me because this was about 10 minutes worth of work. So can I share my screen? Is that loud, Alex? Or Mike, sorry.
Yep, you got it.
Is it working now? Let me see. Can y'all see my screen?
We can.
Okay, let's go to slideshow here. From beginning. It's only 2 slides and then some pictures. Okay. So everyone, a lot of y'all may know me. If you don't, I'm Brandon Huff. I use this fabulous template of a slideshow that we use here at the Air Force Marathon because it's the most professional one I had on hand. So a little bit about me. I was born in Thousand Oaks, California, which is out in the valley just outside of Los Angeles. At the time, my father was active duty Air Force and was working for Rand Corporation for 2 years when I came out. I hate to admit this because it's a little bit young for you guys, but I was born in 1990, just snuck into the 90s, January 19th. I am what they call a millennial. My father is Paul Huff. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, class of 1979. He served 26 years active duty as a finance officer, was 2 times comptroller of the U.S. Air Force, and retired out of Central Command after numerous deployments to the Middle East. And I come from a long line of Air Force. My grandfather was a retired Master Sergeant. My other grandfather was a retired Tech Sergeant. One of my brothers is a current Senior Master Sergeant at Moody Air Force Base. My uncle's a retired Lieutenant Colonel, and I stayed in for 3.5 years to the rank of First Lieutenant. But I am technically a captain in the Air Force Reserves, even though I'm an inactive reservist. It means I don't actually do anything. My mother is Sandy Junn. My parents, you can tell by the last name, my parents divorced when I was quite young, about 4 years old. I've never really known anything else, maybe even when I was 3. So each parent has remarried. My mother, since she was a military spouse, she held a lot of jobs. That just comes with the territory, but she was more focused on being a mother, and she was a wonderful one. I like to think I came out okay. Y'all might disagree, but she's awesome, and she currently lives down in Valdosta, Georgia, Moody Air Force Base area. My father lives in Tampa, Florida, where MacDill Air Force Base is. So I was raised, though, in Panama City, Florida, where Tyndall Air Force Base is. From 4 to 17, I graduated from Rutherford High School in 2007. I then attended the United States Air Force Academy, where I picked up a Bachelor of Science in Economics and a minor in Philosophy. Once I was stationed at Wright Pat, I picked up a Master in Sports Administration from Xavier University. And since I've been back to the area since 2017, I'm on the tail end right now of the Emerging Leader Program at the University of Dayton, thanks to a scholarship I got through Wright Pat Air Force Base. And as of last week, I am in the very beginning of a Master of Public Affairs and Policy Analysis at Indiana University, which so far, after a week, it's a lot of work, but I think I will enjoy the content over the next couple of years. I was active duty Air Force just for a short bit, 2011 to 2014. They had budget cuts, so I separated. I volunteered to separate and got into race directing, where I lived in Los Angeles for 3 years. Our major client was Run Disney. We produced all 4 of their races. We did races on Catalina Island. So I oversaw the operations of about 20 events annually out in SoCal. And when I moved back to be with my girlfriend and fiance and now wife, I came back to the area and started my own business, the Advanced Running Project, which many of y'all know about. I direct some races locally that I own. And I am also the director of the U.S. Air Force Marathon per the template and my background right now once I am off the slideshow. And I've been doing that for 3 years. So it's been a pretty fun 3 years. So here's just the quick and skinny about me, about what I like. I like techno and house music a lot. Most of y'all probably don't even know what that is. EDM is electronic music, but a lot of people who don't know what EDM is just think it's all the same, which kind of sounds like it if you don't know what you listen to. But really, it all boils down to beats per minute. And it's how fast the rhythm of the music is. So techno and house music is all music that falls down to about 115 to 130 beats per minute. It's very good for like working. It's very methodic. So listen to a lot of that. I'm big into baking. Love baking sweets, mostly drop cookies, but I also do like brownies and stuff. I've dabbled in a few other things, but I mostly spend my time making cookies when I can. Big into backpacking. I picked that up through my wife. Some of the things I'm most proud of is I hiked the John Muir Trail right before I moved back here. Did it in 8 days, 250 miles, and picked up 2 14ers, Mount Williamson and Mount, the tallest one in the country, Mount Whitney. Shows how much I care about it. But that was fun. 8 days alone, 250 miles through the wilderness. I did Kilimanjaro with my wife and my father in 2019. I've bagged a couple 14ers. Those are 14,000 foot mountains. Those are the tallest you can get in the lower 48. I've done Mount Tyndall, Mount Williamson, and Mount Whitney. And a long-term backpacking goal is to summit Mount or Denali someday. It's a big goal of mine to get onto the summit. I'm a big existentialist. I'm always questioning life. You know, why are we here? Where are we going? Kind of thing. My wife mocks me because I always try to find the meaning in everything. I love national parks and traveling. A lot of people think of national parks as, you know, the main national parks, but there's actually 420 plus national parks. There's military battlefields, historical parks. There's national rivers, national seashores. They all fall under the national park system. So a big life goal of mine and my wife's is to visit all of them. We've probably visited 40 or 50 so far. So still working on that. And there's one like right over in Xenia. If you guys didn't know, a national historical park. There's one up in Cleveland, all the Wright brothers in the National Aviation Heritage Area. That's all considered a national park. So we've got some right here in our own area. And then lastly, what's really important to me is just doing right by others and doing right for the world. So I try to incorporate that into all I do. I definitely mess up sometimes, but I try. So, and then the last thing I got here is got a couple pictures since I didn't put them into my slideshow. Can you see those still now that I can't see Zoom anymore? So yep. We got my wife and I when we got married in Vermont. My dog Fam, who's a stray that I found, he followed me 14 miles and he's my boy. There he is again. Then that's my cat Forrest. I found him on Stroop. He was lying in the road. He had been hit by a car. He has 14 toes in the front. He's a polydactyl. My graduation from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 2011. Probably one of my favorite photos in my life. It's my grandfather and I at my wedding. My wife and I on the summit of Kilimanjaro on January 1st, 2020. And this picture, I don't know if I can like pause it here, but if it flips, I'll flip back. Me on the left as a senior at the academy. My brother when he was a tech sergeant, he's now a senior master sergeant. My other brother in the middle, who is definitely not a military person, my father, the 06, and then my grandfather who's not wearing his uniform but retired master sergeant. This is Poseidon, my Newfoundland, who's 10 years old. She's an old girl, but she's my life. She's 145 pounds. And I don't know if there's anything else. Yeah, there's me, the runner. That photo, actually, I don't know if there's any more. Yeah, someone took that photo of me when I ran 73 miles in 12 hours to raise money for Rotary last year. I think I raised $1,200 for our club during that run. And then one of my favorite photos of my wife and I at a friend's wedding back in like 2013. So it's kind of the short and skinny on me. I'm sorry if that ran long because it was sloppily prepared. So my bad.
That was awesome, Brandon. I'm waiting for you to put together a Beaver Creek 5K run. So
it's on my mind, man.
Rotary 5K. We can figure this out, man. Beaver Creek's a big city. We can work with.
I want a 5-miler. We just need to get Pete Landrum on board.
We'll work on him. We'll work on him. Thank you for sharing all that you did, Brandon. We're privileged to have you in the club. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Dave Fleming, did he come back? There he is. Dave, I've gone ahead and waived all the fees this week, and for every member other than you. And so you're going to get a $5 fine for your screen freezing.
I was going to do that. And my most magnanimous. Anyway, I was just going to waive the fines for the last month. So I'll include myself in that. Thanks. I'm sorry about the difficulty. I don't know what's wrong. I'm not a
That's okay.
technical.
Do we have any birthdays quickly or anniversaries that we need to go through, Dave?
Well, I had 3 birthdays that are coming up on the 26th. Andrew Hunt, Susan Phillips, and Barb DeMare. And that's about it. No fines.
All right. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Brandon, I forgot, you get to nominate the next show and tell person. You can either do that now if you've given it some thought, or you can wait till the end of the meeting.
I definitely have someone in mind. I don't see her on here, but unless I just missed her, but Teresa Geraci, who sponsored me into Rotary and who I look up to as a wonderful business owner in person.
All right. Would you coordinate that with her?
Yeah, I'll shoot her a text.
Appreciate it. All right, let's move on to Happy Bucks.
All right, I'll throw a happy buck in. We had, I thought, last Friday, the best Founders Day we've had in 2 years.
That joke's getting old, Eric. Dave, can you fine him for that, please?
It was the best we've had in maybe 5 years.
Getting better. Any other Happy Bucks before we move on?
Mike, I'll say the township has gotten an organization called the River Rangers out to the Little Miami River around the Oxbow and Beaver Creek, and they're doing some work to clear out some debris. They're out there, and actually I'm out there on site with them right now.
Nice, thank you, Randy. Any other Happy Bucks?
I got one, Mike. We had our first kind of open house event for Emergency Medical Service Week for the fire department. Had some COVID restrictions, but we had a great turnout Wednesday night at Station 63, and even the residents were happy to be out and about. This week is EMS week, and we thank all the emergency medical service workers nationwide for their work, especially during the pandemic. We have another EMS open house tonight, 6 to 8 at Station 64 on Indian Ripple. So bring the kids out, get to do the CPR machine, stop the bleed, and of course see all the equipment in there. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
I got one totally random. I just read a news story on Tuesday, and I just thought it was such a good thing for our community. I saw that Wright State credit rating was upgraded from negative to stable. I just think that's a great news story for our community, so I was happy to see it.
Yes, great news. Last call for Happy Bucks. All right, we'll move on to announcements. Does anyone have any announcements they'd like to make?
I just want to make a real quick one for those that are here. If you haven't paid your fourth quarter dues, please do so. It's the end of the year, and it's always nice to get all the accounts down to zero so we don't have to make any sorts of accruals and stuff for our tax return.
Thanks, Eric. Any other announcements? All right, we will have a board meeting today after our regular meeting. Of course, all are welcome to attend that. Next week, next Friday, we will be presenting our 3 best options for meeting in person again. This is due to both a raise in dues and a raise in cost associated with meeting back in person. We plan to put together 3 of our best options at the board level and then present that to the club next week. So if you can make that meeting. You will be more informed than someone who wouldn't. And if you know someone who hasn't been on our meetings on Zoom, if you could inform them that that will be a very important one that they might want to attend. The golf outing will be on July 16th. More details to come on that. And then Flags for Heroes, we will be putting out flags again for our Flags for Heroes program. That's going to be on May 25th at Be Hope Church. If you could just show up there at 4 o'clock for the installation. And then we'll take those down June 1st at 4 o'clock. So hopefully those times will work with people, and you all can make it out for that. All right, so at this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Alex Zaharia for the introduction of our program.
Mr. President. Report on that.
TSAC Law Office.
I was asked to introduce Dan Kilpatrick, and I didn't know anybody by that name, couldn't do any research, but I do know a Dan Kirkpatrick, and it's my honor to introduce Dan today. You may know Dan from many things he's done in the community, not only for our community, but our country, and what we're going to hear about today, some of the things he's done worldwide. But you may know Dan from Fairborn City Council and former mayor, where I first met Dan with my work here at Beaver Creek Township. You may know him from serving our country as a retired Air Force colonel, 34 years in the Air Force as a nurse. And then we just talked about it. He's also a retired full-time faculty member from Wright State University. I really got to know Dan during doing training district-wide through Rotary. And I had the pleasure of going through a lot of trainings and meetings as we were both president-elects for our Rotary Club. Of course, you may know Dan is former president of the Fairborn Rotary Club, the second best club in Greene County. So we got to do a lot of trainings together, pets training together, district meetings, conferences, and so on. So we always got to sit at the same table and share stories. So a lot of great stories. You're going to hear some today as well. And you might have got to know Dan from his work on Tour de Gem, where he organized a lot of the rest stop areas. And once again, the best club in Beaver Creek has got the Rest Stop Award since we didn't have one next year, I'm going to say for 2 years in a row. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Kirkpatrick to the club, a fellow Rotarian. And what can you say about someone who's done so much, not only for our country, but our community? So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Alex. Brandon, I want to come back to some of the things that you said. Is Brandon still here?
He had to step away, Dan.
Oh, okay. Well, I also have been to the top of Mount Whitney in California, so just want to let him know that was quite a hike. Anyway, Alex, you have my slides?
I've got him, Dan. Do you need me to bring him up?
Yeah, let me real quick just tell you a little bit about some more stuff about me. I graduated from high school in 1971, so that gives you an idea how old I am. And the draft was still on. I had a very low draft number, so I enlisted in the Air Force Reserves to avoid being drafted, and they made me a medic, which I had no intentions of doing that in life. And while I was in medic school for the Air Force, one of the instructors approached me and said, you ought to think about going to nursing school, which I had never thought of. And so I checked it out and ended up going into nursing. I graduated from nursing school in 1975, worked for about 6 months, and I have to be honest, I absolutely hated it. I thought there's got to be more to life than just working in a hospital like this. So my older sister had joined the Peace Corps out of her college, and she spent 3 years in Africa, in the country of Togo and the country of back then the Central African Republic. So after working as a nurse for about 6 months, I decided I wanted to do something really different. I was in the Air Force Reserves. They gave me a 1-year leave of absence, and I applied to the Peace Corps. And I have to say it was harder to get into the Peace Corps than it was to get into the Air Force. So it was interesting. And when I applied for the Peace Corps, they offered me 2 possibilities. One was to go to Brazil and teach nursing school, and the other was to go to what they called an outer island in Micronesia and provide health care to natives on an island. And that sounded a lot more interesting. So what I was really looking for was a lifetime adventure, and boy, did I get it. So we can bring up the slides now, Mike. And
Yep,
I
give me just one
sent
second.
Mike the slides because I have a lot of internet problems like Dave does. I keep getting messages that my internet connection is unstable. Didn't want a chance of losing the slides.
Give me 1 second. I had them
Okay.
brought up there.
Well, I'll talk about why you're bringing them up. I ended up in what was then called the Truk Islands of Micronesia. They're now referred to as the Chuk Islands. They changed their name a number of years ago. Back then, they were part of a U.S. administered UN trusteeship. There we go. So there's a slide. And again, they were called the Truk Islands when I was there, and now they're referred to as the Chuk Islands. You may have heard of the Truk Islands. They were very big during World War II. It's one of the largest natural lagoons in the world, Truk Lagoon. And it's actually where the Japanese had a lot of their ships during World War II. And in 1944, the US military bombed their ships in Truk Lagoon, sunk a bunch of their ships, like the Japanese sunk a bunch of ours in Pearl Harbor. And now it's considered one of the top scuba diving places in the world because you can dive on ships. Some are right below the surface of the water, some are 50 feet, some are 100 feet, and some are 200 feet down. So scuba diving there is absolutely fantastic if you're a scuba diver. So that's how I ended up in the Truk Islands, or Chuk. Next slide. And just to give you an idea of where we're at, if you look about towards the middle, you see Guam, and just below Guam, you see Chuk. That's the Chuk Islands. Again, they were part of the Micronesian Islands. You might recognize some of the others: Yap, Ponape, Majuro. The Northern Marianas are where Saipan and Rota and Tinian are. Guam is the largest big mile, which is to the north and west of the Chuk Islands. Next slide. I mentioned Truk Lagoon is a great place to go scuba diving. Ironically, I was there in May of 1976 when this edition of the National Geographic came out in May of 1976. So if you really want to learn more about it, find a copy of this, May 1976. It talks about Truk Lagoon. That's one of the Japanese tanks that's sunk there that people can go scuba diving on. It's really an incredible place for scuba diving or snorkeling. Next slide. Now, I lived to the on the main island of Moen, which is now called Ueno. They changed the names a number of years ago. This is a picture of Truk Lagoon. And Moen is at about, from the center of the picture, about the 2 o'clock position. In this entire lagoon, there were Japanese ships scattered all over. And we sunk a bunch of those in the lagoon. Now, most of them were not warships. Most of them were troop ships and cargo ships. But there are a few ships that had, like the previous slide, had Japanese military armaments sunk on them. So if you're an avid scuba diver, many people consider this one of the top 2 or 3 places in the world to scuba dive in Truk Lagoon. Next slide. Now this is a picture of Moen, just to give you an example of it. One of the interesting things about Moen, in the upper left, you see that rectangular, long, narrow strip. That's actually the airport there. And Ueno is the main island there. It's where the airport is. It's where the hospital was. It's where the seat of government for that particular area of Micronesia. Now, the really interesting thing about that runway is you notice that both ends extend out over the water. And at the time I was there, it was considered the shortest jet runway in the world. And government officials would land there, and the 727s, which were mainly the aircraft that landed there, as they got to the end of the runway and would turn to taxi back, the wings would be out over the water. That's how short the runway is. And the story that was going on while I was there is that a government official from Saipan landed there and was so frightened by the experience that he insisted that the local government put a boat offshore with first aid supplies in case the plane went off the end of the runway. And the story goes the very next day, sure enough, there was a local truckee's man in his outrigger canoe with a first aid kit sitting in his lap. And that kind of tells you how they treated things there. It was a very low-key environment. Now you look right in the middle, you see what's called Pou Bay, P-O-U Bay. That name kind of came about because of previous Peace Corps volunteers. That bay was lined with what we call a benjo. Benjo is actually a Japanese word because the Japanese inhabited these islands during World War II. A benjo is an over-the-water Japanese bathroom. And that Pou Bay, all the houses there, their bathrooms were little huts on stilts that you would walk across a downed log out to this little hut that was maybe 10 feet off the shore. And you'd open the little thatched door and there's a hole in the floor. And that's where you went to the bathroom. And so you can imagine with all these people living around there, it became Pou Bay, virtue of the local Peace Corps volunteers. And we did some public health studies there, very, very polluted, obviously. Next slide. Okay, this is actually where I lived. This was Nam Nguyen Lagoon, which is about 60 miles north of Truk Lagoon. And you'll notice in the bottom left, there's a little white spot. That was the island of Nam Nguyen. There you go with the arrow. And in the upper right, you see two small islands. The one on the left is Fananu. That's the island I lived on. And the other island to the right is Igup, and Igup was not inhabited. I lived on the island of Fananu there. From Fananu to Nam Nguyen is about 11 miles. And you can't see one island from the other because of the curvature of the earth and all. But once a month when I lived on Fananu, someone from the island of Nam Nguyen would come and get me in a little tiny motorboat, usually with one little small engine, and they would take me back to Nam Nguyen, and I would provide health care to the people on that island. And one time, heading to Nam Nguyen from Fananu, if you look down that straight part, you see a little tiny white dot. Follow the arrow a little further down, right there. That was a little tiny bit of an island, maybe 100 square yards or smaller, had 3 palm trees on it. And the reason I mention that is that little motorboat that we were on one time, about 50 yards out into the water from that little tiny island, the motor stopped and we couldn't get it started. I was with 2 other local truckees people from Nam Nguyen. So we threw the little cement can over the side as an anchor and we swam to that little island and we rubbed sticks together and we started a fire from some of the down palm fronds, and that attracted the people on Nam Nguyen. The next morning they came and got us. So I was marooned on a little tiny island with 2 other truckees guys overnight. So that was part of the experience. It was very interesting. So I would spend maybe a week, a month at Nam Nguyen, and then the rest of the time I lived on Fananu. Next slide. And Fananu was a fantastic island. The people there were very much into living in the off the land. They fished every day. They had, it was what we call a sand island. So they would make crops, they would grow crops, but in sand, crops don't grow very good. They tried growing carrots, and carrots ended up being long and stringy. The thickest part might be the diameter of your thumb at the most. Most of the time they were just long and stringy. Now, right before I got to Fananu, when I was on the main island for some language training, a typhoon had gone through the area. It was Typhoon Pamela. In their local language, they called it Typhoon Pamela. And it wiped out the breadfruit crops and the taro crops, which were most of the food that people lived on and ate on the islands. Now, they went fishing every day. There was no refrigeration, there was no electricity, there was no running water. We consumed water that came off the roof into barrels, the roofs of the huts. So we would eat fish just about every day that the men would go out and fish, and the ladies would tend their little gardens where they had some bananas that, again, didn't grow very well in sand. The carrots are what they tried to grow, but they were long and stringy. Well, as a result of that typhoon that happened, the US government, who had a UN trusteeship over the islands, brought out typhoon relief food. It was USDA typhoon relief food. And it was bags and bags and bags of 100-pound bags of rice, which they liked and they ate. And there would be cases of other kinds of foods, most of which they had never seen before. You got to remember, these people lived in a very isolated existence. The one that was the funniest that they brought to us, the USDA, they had big quart-sized cans of peas and carrots. Well, they had never seen peas before, and they, little round things. How do you grow little round things? But what they were really confused about was in the cans of peas and carrots, they couldn't understand how in America did we grow little square carrots. They were just amazed that we could grow little square carrots in America. And I would explain to them, well, we have bigger carrots than you do, and they get processed and cut up into little squares. But they were just amazed with the little square carrots. They thought that was really funny. The other thing is they went fishing every day, and lobsters there are different than lobsters you see on the East Coast. They don't have claws out there, but they have big tails. And they don't like the taste of lobster. Well, I grew up in Southern California, and I do like the taste of lobster. Well, one of the other typhoon relief foods that we got was cans of USDA butter. And in the tropical heat there, the butter was always melting. So every day when the men would go by the first aid hut where I worked, they would stop by and say, if we see a lobster, do you want us to get you one? I'd say, sure. Well, I officially lived with the chief of the island's family, so they would take care of making sure I got fed. But I actually lived in the first aid hut that was about 50 yards down a trail from the chief's house. And so during lobster season, when the lobsters come up onto the reefs to molt and to mate, I was averaging at least one lobster a day for about a month and a half, along with this melted butter that came in the cans. And again, they didn't care for it. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the other food that we ate, in particular the fish. The fishing there was phenomenal. The natives the men went fishing every day. They did not fish with a pole and a line with a hook. They would fish by going into the water with spears. And the spears that they had were actually made from submarine nets that were put up in Truck Lagoon to keep the American submarines out of the lagoon. And the submarine nets were pieces of wire that were about the size of your small finger that were woven together into circles about 1.5 feet big. And then the circles were all weaved together. And the Japanese, when they were concerned about American submarine coming in, would pull these nets across the opening into Truck Lagoon to try to keep American submarines out. Well, after the war, the Truckies are very creative. They took these pieces of this metal and unwound it and straightened out the long pieces, and they would pound a arrow point on the end of it and make like these 6-foot-long spearfishing tools to go into the water and spearfish with. And I actually went out with them several times, and I spearfished with them. Some of the things they did I was not real comfortable with. when they would spear a fish, they carried a piece of rope around their waist, and they would swim down to where the fish was. They would run the rope through the mouth and the gill, and then tie the rope back around their waist and go on to spear another fish. Well, when you're in the water there, I'd say at least 90% of the time where you're swimming around, fishing or just swimming, you saw black-tipped reef sharks. And they would be anywhere from 3 foot to 8 foot long. And the first time I went in the water, and you always wore a snorkel mask, I saw this black-tipped reef shark swimming towards me. And I have to say, I was a little beyond concerned. But the natives all laughed at me and they said, just wave your arms. And sure enough, the sharks would swim away. They were curious. They would get to within about 8 feet of you and just swim around you, looking at you. And then when you waved your arms, they'd swim away. So when I went spearfishing with them, I would spear a fish and I would give it to one of them and they would tie it around their waist. Because every once in a while, you'd see an older Truckees person who had scars on their waist or on their buttock area. And that's from when a shark actually tried to bite the fish that they had caught, and they accidentally got bit by the shark. The sharks didn't actively go after people, but when you're swimming around with 4 or 5 fish hanging off your waist and it's trailing blood, that would attract the sharks. And sometimes they would try to bite the fish that was around somebody's waist, and they'd miss and get the fisherman. The other fish that we really enjoyed eating there, 2 kinds. One was tuna, and they were huge tuna. The way they knew the tuna were around is, if you remember the map where it showed Fananu, you saw the outer reef. The tuna would not come inside the lagoon between Namwin and Fananu, but they would be outside the lagoon. And the way the natives knew that the tuna were around is the seagulls would land on the water, and as the tuna fed on other things, other fish, other, whatever they were eating on, the pieces of that would float to the surface, and the seagulls would be eating that stuff. So whenever they saw a flock of seagulls sitting on the water outside the lagoon, they knew it was the tuna feeding. And so they would yell tuna, whatever, and a couple of boats would go out there, these little motor boats, and we'd go outside the lagoon. And I went with them one time. And the way they fished for tuna, again, no poles, and they didn't get down into the water. They had about 200 feet of rope with about a 10-foot steel leader on the end of it with a treble hook. And they would take palm fronds that were turning from green to yellow and tie them around the treble hook. So as we trolled through the seagulls on the surface, holding on to this rope, whenever the rope got pulled tight, you knew you had a tuna, and you'd frantically pull it in to the boat and then throw the tuna into the boat. Now, for those of you who like sushi, like fresh tuna sushi, it was fresh there because we'd take a knife and we'd take a slice off the tuna as it was flopping around in the boat, and we'd eat the sushi right there, the raw tuna right in the boat. And that's what they would eat while they were fishing. So anyway, I happened to catch a 48-inch tuna one time when I went out with them, and that was not the biggest. These were huge tuna. The last time I went out with them, one of the guys was pulling in the rope, and it started getting easier to pull and easier. And by the time he got the tuna up to the boat, when he pulled it up, all that was left on the hook was the head of the tuna. And what was happening is the sharks were feeding on the tuna as they were pulling it in. So that signaled the end of that tuna fishing because the sharks were all over in the water around us. The other fish that was really popular there was a fish that to this day, I don't know what the real name of it is. They called it batu. And they were like 6-inch fish, and they would be in schools of thousands of them. And they would be inside the reef on one side of the island where there was a lot of grassy area under the water. And the batu would be feeding on the grassy area. And when the natives would see those fish out there, because there'd be thousands of them and they'd be flipping around on the surface and all, they would yell, batu, batu. And everybody would take a palm frond and we would circle way around the fish with a palm frond, and then they would slowly collapse the circle in, and you're swishing the palm frond in front of you, forcing these batu fish closer and closer to the shore. And then when we got them right up next to the shore, the little kids would go out with buckets, and they would scoop up 20, 30 batu at a time and throw them up on the shore. And by the time we would catch a bunch of them, and we would catch probably a couple thousand of them, batu was one of the best tasting fish I ever had. They would cook it on an open grill. It was very delicate. They would also dry it, salt it, and save it for later times. But again, one of the times we were batu fishing, and we're out there swishing the water to try to force the batu closer to the shore, somebody yelled out, "Parao, parao." And in the Truckee language, parao means shark. So somehow we had trapped a shark inside with the batu, and that shark was feeding on the batu. But the natives were very nervous about that. They were swishing a lot more than usual because they didn't want the shark to accidentally bite into one of their legs. And fortunately, the shark did slip out. But that was one of the interesting things about the way they fished. But the snorkeling there, if you ever get a chance to snorkel in that part of the world, is absolutely incredible. Lionfish, rockfish, all kinds of tropical reef fish. It was really incredible. Right next to the island, right by the first aid hut where I lived, there was a channel that was about 10 feet out, was about 10 feet deep, 20 feet out was about 20 feet deep. And it formed a little bit of a channel on that side of the island. And I would actually lay on the shore with my head in the water, wearing a mask and a snorkel, and the sharks would swim through that channel. And you could just watch these, half a dozen sharks at a time just swimming by. It was fascinating to watch sharks swimming. They're an incredible creature. This slide shows some of the stuff. Those pieces in the front ground are coral. Those two flat pieces are called razor coral. If you step on those, you will cut your feet because they're very sharp. The other piece to the left of the razor coral, that's called brain coral because it looks like a brain. All the other stuff are seashells. I brought back a bunch of seashells. They were all over the place. And I found out that the little native kids loved collecting beads from the United States, little beads like you use for making decorations and stuff. So I had my parents send me boxes of beads, and I would trade the natives beads for seashells. And you're only seeing a small number of the seashells that I collected and shipped home. To the right there, you see a couple of carved items. One's a dolphin. The two in the forefront are sharks. They weren't the best wood carvers, but I have those at home. That's some of the stuff they made. The figure there, that was the way their warriors looked way back. They don't have any warriors nowadays, but the warriors were very majestic. The island chief where I lived, he was a very majestic looking person. He looked very much like that. What he's holding in his left hand is a Truckee's battle sword. And this is obviously a small version. I have some full-size ones that I collected and brought home. They would take shark's teeth and embed them in the edges of those swords when they would fight islanders from other places. None of that happens now, but that's some of the stuff they did. That outrigger canoe that you see right there, the island chief made that. And when I was getting ready to leave and my time was up there, he presented me that as a going away gift. Very, very impressive guy. And he had eyed this buck folding knife that I had, that I took with me over there. And so I handed him the buck knife. He handed me the canoe, and he was all smiles because he really liked that buck knife. But that was just some of the stuff. That item in the middle that's curved, that's actually what they call a breadfruit pounder. And breadfruit was the common staple, like potatoes are for us or rice is for us. Unfortunately, the typhoon that went through right before I went to the island, it wiped out all their breadfruit crop. It destroyed a lot of the trees and ruined the crop for that year. But that is what they call a breadfruit pounder. When they would cook the breadfruit, they would boil it, and then when the chunks were done cooking, they would pound it into a paste using that device. That thing is about 8 inches tall, and it weighs a couple pounds, but that's how they would pound the breadfruit into this paste, and then they would eat that with their fingers, again, just like we eat potatoes. And during the time when it wasn't breadfruit season, they would take extra breadfruit that they had collected, they would wrap it up in banana leaves, and they would bury it. And then they would dig it up a couple months later and eat it. You had to pick the bugs out of it, but they still liked it and they still ate it. That item to the far left, that's actually a coconut shell. And if you've ever had really fresh coconut milk, like right out of a tree, it's wonderful. It's one of the best drinks you'll ever have. Well, they collected the coconuts and they would hollow out the shells like that. And that's what they used for a canteen when they would go fishing out on the boats. They would take one of those full of water and they had other pieces of it that would cover the top. But that they utilized everything there. Next slide. Okay, these are just some of their weapons. Those two tall things are canoe paddles, and those are full size. And again, the native islanders gave me those when I left. The top item there, that's one of those battle swords that they would use when they fight. Now they make those strictly as decorations and to sell to the tourists that are out there. That island in the middle, it looks a little bit like an axe or a hatchet. They actually would take a piece of coral and sharpen it, and that was what they used. It's called an adze, and they would hollow out breadfruit trees to make their outrigger canoes. And so it would take a while, take weeks to hollow it out. Now those things have a metal blade on the tip of them, and they still use it to hollow out their canoes. And again, you see some of the coconuts that were used as canteens. Next slide. On the main island on Moen, that's where most of the scuba divers went. So all of the islanders all around that area made things to sell in the tourist shops, the craft shops on the main island. And these are what they call truckies masks. And I don't know if you can tell, but one is a male and one is a female. Can anybody figure out which is the male and which is the female and why? Okay, the male is the one on the right, and the way you can tell is that little goatee on the bottom that Mike is highlighting right there. That's the only way you can tell the difference. So they made stuff like this to sell to tourists that would come through there. The main island gets a lot of tourists because of the scuba diving there. And they have a dive shop there. You can refill tanks. They have all kinds of things that can go out. The island I lived on, no electricity, no running water. So we had no way to fill tanks. So we didn't scuba dive, but where I lived, you didn't really need to. The coral reefs were right below the surface, and they were absolutely incredible. Next slide. Okay, this is just to show you. Now, this is not where I was at. I found this slide on the internet, but this looks very much like the island I lived on. And you can see to the right there, that is a black-tipped reef shark. You see the back half of it, and you see all this other tropical fish. That is very much like where I lived. The tropical fish, all different colors, all different types. A few of them you had to stay away from. The lionfish and the rockfish were poisonous. They both had poisonous spines. Obviously, you want to stay away from the sharks. We also had barracuda that were around the island, and the natives tried not to catch barracuda because they have really sharp teeth, and they can cause significant injuries. The other thing is there were a lot of moray eels that lived in the coral reefs, and every once in a while they would catch an eel, and they were huge. They were like 6-7 foot long, these eels, and they would eat those. But the fish selection there for food was absolutely incredible. Next slide. Now, they had Peace Corps on our island before, the island I lived on. While I was there, I was the only Peace Corps volunteer. And they used to joke about Americans. Now, they really liked America. And one of their goals for them was to someday get to go to America. But they had a word for American, and the word was Chon Mung Pisak in the Truckese language. And the way they would describe Americans, they would say, oh, Americans, Chon Mung Pisak. And it meant what you're seeing on the screen, that Americans had too many possessions. And that was really the absolute truth. The Americans that came out there, I brought all this stuff with me, and they would kind of laugh at it because they didn't have any of that stuff. Next slide. Now, this was the day before I came home. The island I lived on, we had no barbers, so I let my hair grow. And I'm actually still in the Air Force Reserves in this picture with that leave of absence. But that's the only time in my life my hair ever got that long. Next slide. Now, I'll close by saying this. It was a fantastic experience. The singular best experience of my life. I learned a lot about being around other people. I learned a lot about myself. These were the poorest people I have ever been around. They virtually had nothing, but they were the happiest people I've been around. They would laugh and tell jokes and tell stories. They laughed at some of my jokes. I mean, I learned enough of the Truckese language, but they were really happy people. Now, real quick, I know we're out of time. I mentioned that a lot of them wanted to come to America. When I came back home, I went back to work in the hospital I had been working. It was a psychiatric facility, a locked psychiatric unit in San Bernardino, California. And I had been back about a month and a half, and I worked the evening shift. And one evening when I came in, the day shift staff were real excited, and they said, look, we have somebody back there. We think he's crazy, but we're not sure. The police picked him up because he was walking down the street talking gibberish, but he kept saying truck, truck. And we didn't know if he meant a pickup truck or did he mean truck where you were, because they all knew I'd been in the Peace Corps in the Truck Islands. And they said, he keeps saying the word truck, but we can't understand anything. So I walked up to him out on the unit and I said hello to him in Truckese, which is Rananim, means hello in Truckese. And he looked at me startled and I said, Efasum, which means how are you? And he started talking to me in Truckese. And it turns out he had come to America to visit a previous Peace Corps volunteer in San Bernardino, and they went to the mall together and they got separated. And he didn't speak any English. And eventually someone reported him to a policeman who thought he was crazy because he was talking Truckese. And so they brought him to the locked psychiatric unit. And when I walked in and said Rananim to him, he just lit up. And it turns out he knew the name of the person that he was with, and we were able to contact him, and he came and got him. So we talk about it being a small world. What's the chances of me having been to truck, and that evening when I go to work, there's a Truckese guy who's lost in a foreign country. So all in all, absolutely fantastic experience. If you have a chance to do the Peace Corps, I would highly encourage it. They do take retirees. A lot of people retire and go do something like that. Peace Corps is still very active. That picture there, again, is not my island, but that could have been my island. That's how beautiful it was there. Okay, we're done with the slides, Mike, if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Dan. Got time for maybe one question?
Dan,
All right.
You mentioned that, you had interaction with the chief, and you mentioned different islands. Were there like different chiefs and tribes on each island, or was there like a chief of over several islands?
Every island had their own chief. And several Peace Corps people before me had been people with political science degrees. And what the US government was trying to do, they were trying to force each island to have elected positions instead of an island chief. And I have to tell you, it did not go over well. I mean, these people had lived on these islands for hundreds, thousands of years, and they had an island chief, and that's who they respected. The chief on my island was very well thought of. They elected a magistrate to the island, but I have to tell you, they ignored him. They didn't want anything to do with him. And I did come away from that experience with the idea that sometimes we need to leave people alone, let them do their own thing. They were the nicest people I've ever been around. The chief was very fair. He didn't do anything wrong. Now, maybe some of the other islands, they'd had a bad experience with the chief, but the island I lived on, Fananu, the chief was fantastic. The magistrate was a nice guy, but he had no power at all. Previous Peace Corps volunteers had been school teachers, political science people. I was their first medical person. And what I was doing, providing health care on the island, while someone from the island went to the main island to get some basic medical care training, because their health care there, as you can imagine, was, for lack of a better term, very primitive. And I forgot to mention, if I have time, Mike, real quick, everybody there had intestinal parasites, amoeba, roundworms, trichuris, and the Peace Corps gave us microscopes and a flashlight, and they told us collect stool specimens from people. And I had a book on tropical diseases, and when I told the people on the island when I got there, I want a stool specimen from you so I can see what kind of parasite you got, they were absolutely, totally disgusted with that. And nobody would do it. And they had one young man who was sort of assigned to me to help teach me the language and all. And I finally convinced him to give me a stool specimen. And I looked it up, and sure enough, I found the intestinal parasite that he had. I showed him on the microscope, and he was like amazed. And I gave him the medicine for it. And for the first time in his life, he had a solid bowel movement, because everybody with intestinal parasites had chronic diarrhea. And when word got around that he had a solid bowel movement, within a week, every morning when I came out of my hut, there'd be 20, 30 stool specimens on the ground in front of my hut. So I ended up spending every morning looking at poop under a microscope, and then going around to the different villages and giving them the medicine for the right person, because they had a variety of different intestinal parasites. But for the first time in their life, they had solid bowel movement. So they were, I could do no wrong after that. So.
Wow, Dan. Important work, super interesting. Thank you for presenting and sharing with our club. That's really interesting. Maybe we can get you back here when
Sure.
we get another meeting. So we do have a tradition in our club to dedicate a book to the Beaver Creek Library in your honor. So I'll turn it over to Beth to do that.
Okay. Hi, Beth.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And after your last story, I'm checking my supply of books to see if maybe I need to change it up, but I don't have anything applicable to that. So,
No poop books. Huh?
so I'm going to go with the book that I have planned here. It's called Escape Room from Thorn House. It's about a group of 7th graders over the summer that do an escape room game at a creepy old estate called Thorn
It
House.
sounds like fun.
Sounds like a fun book. So thank you
Yep.
so much, Dan. Good to
You're
see
welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Join us anytime if you'd
Yes.
like. Next week, we will have Judge Adolfo Tornicio talking to us about his judicial story, and he will be introduced by Tom Kugler. Please keep an eye on upcoming programs at beavercreekrotary.com and Facebook. Again, if you want to attend the board meetings, please stay right there. Other than that, we will see you back here next week.